Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Mike Allen. As you know, I've been reading through Patriots History of the United States. Hold on, let me adjust something here. There we go. I had to adjust a shadow there. You'll notice I'm still in a t-shirt because it's still Arizona, and it's still summer, and it's still hot. Okay, so as always, I'm reading from the 15th anniversary edition of Patriots History of the United States. If you have an earlier edition, the headers should line up. The page numbers probably won't. So if you have an older edition, go by the headers. All right. We are in the header called Democracy's First Test on page 159. 2 months earlier, President Washington had delivered his famed farewell address. Physically and mentally wearied by decades of service and literally sickened by the political bickering that characterized his last term in office, Washington decided to step down. He was also motivated by a desire to set a precedent of serving only 2 terms, a move that evinced the strong fear of authoritarianism shared by all Whig revolutionaries, Federalist and Republican alike. The Constitution placed no limit on the number of terms a chief executive could serve, but Washington set such a limit on himself, and every president adhered to the 1796 precedent until 1940. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's reversal via 3rd and 4th terms, even if coming as it did during national crises, so concerned the nation that the 22nd Amendment, 1951, was a Constitution, making Washington's practice a fundamental law. Appropriately, Washington's farewell speech was written to a great extent by Hamilton, although the president read and edited several drafts. The address called for nationalism, neutrality, and nonpartisanship. Republicans no doubt pondered over the sincerity of Washington's and Hamilton's last 2 points. Certainly, nationalism was a Federalist hallmark, and Washington reiterated his deep belief in the need for union versus the potential damages of regionalism, states' rights, and geographical distinction. In foreign policy, the chief executive reemphasized the goals of his proclamation of neutrality to offer friendship and commerce with all nations, but to steer clear of, quote, political connection and permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Now, if you read the whole address, many have taken this to say, see, Washington didn't want any alliances ever. That's not what it says if you read the whole address. Basically, he said, we can't afford an alliance for 20 years. Our military won't be ready. We don't have the population. We won't have the economy to get involved in an alliance for at least 20 years. He used that 20-year phrase 2 or 3 times. And so it was clear that he was thinking that the nation would grow and that at a certain point it would be ready to enter such alliances, but not yet. So I think if you're using this as a proof text that Washington favored no alliances with anyone, I don't think that's correct. Remember, he was all too happy to take an alliance with France and Spain in the American Revolution. All right. Much has been made of Washington's warning not to become involved in European affairs. This after having just cemented a new international trade agreement with Spain and Great Britain. Washington knew better than to think the United States could isolate itself permanently. He stated, quote, 20 years peace with such an increase of population and resources as we have a right to expect, added to our remote situation from the jarring powers, will in all probability enable us in a just cause to bid defiance to any power on earth. Emphasis ours. In other words, in 20 years, we're going to be able to say to any nation on earth because we'll be protected by oceans and we'll have enough of an economy and enough of a military that we can defend ourselves. Until then, we got to be careful. His concern that the young nation would be drawn into strictly Continental squabbles, especially those between Britain and France, reflected not an unwillingness to engage in the international use of power, but an admission of the weakness of the American might. In North America, for example, Washington himself had virtually instigated the French and Indian War, so he certainly was under no illusions about the necessity for military force, nor did he discount the ability of the Europeans to affect America with their policies. Rather, the intent was to have the United States lay low and, where prudent, refrain from foreign interventions. Note that Washington gave the United States 20 years to gain international maturity, a time frame ending with the War of 1812. Further, America's insulation by the oceans kept these goals at the core of American foreign policy for the next century, until transportation and communication finally rendered them obsolete. Finally, and incongruously, Washington cautioned against political partisanship. This phrase, penned by Hamilton, at best was a call to better behavior on all sides, and at worst was simply a throwaway phrase for public consumption. Washington apparently did not see Hamilton's scheming and political maneuvering as partisan endeavor, and therefore saw no irony in the pronouncement. Concluding with an appeal to the sacred, as he frequently did, Washington stated that religion and morality are indispensable supports. It would be hopeless, he implored, to think that men could have, quote, security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths of office holders, emphasis ours. In such arenas as the Supreme Court, where the oaths provided enforcement of those protections, Washington somberly noted mere morality alone could not survive without religious principle. His speech was a quintessential embodiment of a phrase often ridiculed more than 200 years later: character counts. Washington's warning to the nation, though, was that effective government required more than a chief executive of high moral fiber. The entire nation had to build the country on the backs of its citizens' behavior. Having delivered this important speech, the general quietly finished out his term and returned to his beloved Virginia, attending one last emotional ceremony inauguration of his vice president, John Adams, after he had won the election of 1796. The father of our country would not live to see the new century, but his legacy to the American posterity was never exceeded and rarely matched. Historian John Carroll listed no fewer than 10 achievements of Washington's 2 administrations, including developing a policy for the disposition of public lands, establishing credit at home and abroad, removing the British troops from the Northwest, and several others. Another historian concluded, quote, by agreeing to serve not 1 but 2 terms of office, Washington gave the new nation what above all else it needed: time. It might also be said that Washington loaned the young republic some of his own character, modeling virtuous behavior of a president for all who followed. Quasi-war. Despite the succession of a number of Washington's own party and administration, the election of 1796 elevated to power a man much different in temperament and personality than the great general he replaced. John Adams was both ably suited for and considerably handicapped in the fulfillment of his presidential duties. The 62-year-old president-elect still possessed a keen intellect, pious devotion, and selfless patriotism, but age had made him more irascible than ever. His enemies pounced on his weaknesses. The Aurora newspaper referred to him as old, garrulous, bald, blind, and crippled. To which Abigail, his wife, quipped that only she was capable of making such an assessment about her husband. Adams, however, excelled in foreign policy matters, which was fortunate at a time when the nation had been thrust into the imbroglio of the Anglo-French rivalry. With no help from Republican opponents or Federalist extremists within his own party, Adams rose above factionalism and averted war. In the process, he paid a huge political price for his professionalism. Top of 161. For at least a decade, the British had bullied Americans on the high seas and at the treaty table. In 1797, the French decided it was their turn. Angered by Federalist Anglophilia and the subservience evidenced in Jay's treaty, France too began to seize and confiscate American shipping to the tune of 300 vessels. French aggression shocked and silenced Republicans. Among the Federalists, the response was surprisingly divided. Predictably, Hamiltonians and other arch-Federalists who had bent over backward to avoid a war with Britain now pounded the drums of war against France. A popular toast of the day to Adams was, "May he, Adams, like Samson, slay thousands of Frenchmen with the jawbone of a Jefferson." Adams himself and the moderates, however, followed the president's lead and tried to negotiate a peace. They were stymied initially by unscrupulous Frenchmen. To negotiate with the French foreign minister, Charles Talleyrand, a master of personal survival skills who had avoided the guillotine under the Jacobins, later survived the irrationalities of Emperor Napoleon, then later still had returned to represent the restored Bourbon monarchy. Adams sent Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Thomas's brother, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry to Paris. The French minister was also well-versed in the fine art of diplomatic bribery. Mirabeau once said Talleyrand, quote, would sell his soul for money, and he would be right, for he would be exchanging dung for gold. Upon arrival, however, the Americans were not officially allowed to present their credentials to the foreign minister, an immense snub. At an official meeting with 3 French agents referred to anonymously by the American press as agents XYZ, the Americans learned that the French agents expected a bribe before they would be granted an audience with French officials. Pinckney, Marshall, and Gerry refused such a profane act and immediately returned home. So to pick up, Pinckney, Marshall, and Gerry refused such a profane act as paying this bribe and immediately returned home. Newspapers later reported that Pinckney had proclaimed to agents X, Y, and Z that Americans would gladly spend, quote, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, a line that is used repeatedly. It's more probable he uttered the less quotable, "It is no, not a sixpence," but regardless, the French got the message. Negotiations abruptly ended, and the arch-federalists had their issue. Before long, the infamous XYZ affair produced a war fever and temporarily solidified the Federalist power base. After recovering somewhat from their initial shock, Republicans asked why Americans should declare war on France for aggression identical to that which Great Britain had perpetrated with impunity for nearly a decade. Adams stood between the 2 groups of extremists, urging more negotiations while simultaneously mustering thousands of soldiers and sailors in case shooting started. He'd benefited from the authorization by Congress 2 years earlier of 6 frigates, 3 of which were rated at 44 guns, although only the United States and the Constellation actually carried that number. These vessels, which Adams referred to as, quote, floating batteries and wooden walls, entered service just as tensions on the oceans peaked. In February 1799, open fighting between American and French ships erupted on the high seas, precipitating an undeclared war dubbed by historians as the Quasi-War. So we're going to stop there. I'll pick up next time with a brand new insert I have from a great source called 6 Frigates by Ian Toll. And I think you'll really like the introduction to this new material, which is not in this book. So we will pick up there next time. A reminder, folks, I need your help. If you're watching this, we're trying to turn Patriot's history into a feature film like Sound of Freedom. We can do it. We have a great story. I'll tell you about it later. It's awesome. But watch the concept trailer at the website. You scroll down a little bit and you'll see the concept trailer. Watch that. And if you like it, buy me a coffee or buy me 20 coffees or 5 coffees or whatever it is. Contribute to this project. It is crowdfunding. We need all your help. So help us out. And I'll see you guys back here on Monday.